The year was 1847. In the forgotten Dust Bowl of Millfield, Arizona, secrets were the only crop that ever grew, and 23-year-old Evangeline Rose, she held the deadliest one of all. They called her the strange girl, the recluse in the cabin by the creek, the one whose eyes were older than the mountains and held shadows that danced like ghosts. In all her life, not a single soul had ever held her. Not once. She didn't know the warmth of an embrace, the simple comfort of a hand in hers. She was an island, surrounded by a town that watched her, whispered about her, but never, ever got close. But what they didn't know, what no one could have possibly guessed, was that everything was about to change. Because a rider was coming. A man on a black horse, moving through the twilight not like a traveler, but like a man being hunted. He was a widower, they would soon learn. But the grief he carried was a lie. It was a mask for something far heavier, far more dangerous. And in the silence that hung between them, in the storm that was about to break over their heads, Evangeline would finally discover what it meant to live, and what it meant to fight for your life. Evangeline Rose stood at the cracked window of her cabin, the glass like a spiderweb of old stories. The setting sun bled across the desert, painting the rocks in hues of blood and rust. It had been a hard year in Millfield, but for Evangeline every year was hard. It was a quiet, grinding hardness that had settled deep in her bones. 7 years she'd been alone, ever since the mine collapsed and took her father, ever since the fever stole her mother the winter after. She was beautiful, in a wild, unsettling way, raven hair that fell in untamed waves, emerald eyes that seemed to look right through you, to see the secrets you kept locked away. Men in town would stop and stare, but none of them ever dared to approach. It wasn't just respect for her solitude, as they told themselves. It was fear. A quiet, unspoken fear of the girl who lived by Willow Creek, the girl who knew the earth a little too well. Her cabin was small, built by her father's own hands. Her life was a simple loop. Tend the garden, sew dresses for the townswomen, help Doc Henderson when sickness came. Her hands were skilled, her touch was gentle, but they were hands that had never held another. She would try to remember her mother's arms, but the memory was smoke. Her father had been a good man, a strong man, but his love was in the cabin's sturdy walls, not in his embrace. The townsfolk were kind, in their own distant way. Mrs. Abernathy at the general store saved her the best fabrics. Young Timothy Fletcher tipped his hat. Reverend Morrison prayed for her soul, but it was the kindness you'd show a stray wolf, a kindness that kept a safe distance. It was a weapon against the loneliness, but a dull one. The ache in her chest was a permanent resident. Tonight, though, the air was different. It hummed. It vibrated with a strange energy, like the moments before a lightning strike. She felt a restlessness she couldn't name, a sense of something hurtling toward her down a long, dark road. She tried to dismiss it, braiding her hair with practiced hands, her reflection a pale ghost in the warped glass. She had no way of knowing that the feeling was a warning. She didn't know that in a matter of moments, a stranger would arrive, dragging a storm of violence behind him, a storm that would either destroy her or finally set her free. The sound shattered the evening quiet. Hoofbeats, hard and desperate on the packed earth. Evangeline was on her porch, mending a dress, the needle a tiny silver fish in her fingers. She looked up. A figure emerged from the dust and twilight, a phantom on a powerful black stallion. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he slumped in the saddle like a man carrying the weight of the world. He didn't ride like a traveler looking for rest. He rode like a man running from hell itself. He guided his horse to the creek beside her property, not with grace, but with a desperate, jerky motion. He practically fell from the saddle. He wasn't just weary from travel. He was hurt, badly. He stumbled to the water's edge, his movements clumsy, his face etched with a pain that went far beyond simple sadness. He was maybe in his mid-30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, and a face that was all harsh angles and deep shadows. He plunged his hands into the creek, splashing water on his face, but his movements were stiff. He tried to unhitch his canteen, but his fingers fumbled. Evangeline stayed frozen on her porch, the mending forgotten in her lap. Her heart, usually so quiet, began to hammer against her ribs. This was not a simple widower seeking lodging. This was something else entirely. When he turned, his shirt was dark with more than just water. It was soaked through with blood. He finally looked up, and their eyes met across the 50 feet of dying light that separated them. His eyes were the color of a gathering storm, gray and turbulent. And in them, she saw a pain so raw, so violent, that it made the loneliness in her own heart feel like a child's complaint. For a long, stretched moment, there was only the sound of the creek and the ragged gasps of his breath. He tried to speak, to offer a greeting, but it came out as a choked cough. He pressed a hand to his side, and a fresh wave of agony washed over his face. He staggered, his legs threatening to give out from under him. He was a dead man walking, and he had stumbled right into her solitary world. Every instinct she had, honed by years of solitude and self-preservation, screamed at her to run, to lock the door, bar the windows, and pretend she hadn't seen a thing. The town of Millfield didn't take kindly to trouble, and this man was trouble incarnate. Bringing him in would be inviting a whirlwind into her quiet life. But then he looked at her again, and in his eyes, she didn't just see a stranger. She saw a mirror. She saw a soul just as cornered, just as haunted as her own. And in that moment, she made a decision that would seal her fate. She dropped her sewing, stood up, and walked toward the bleeding man at her creek. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his crime, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that their ghosts were about to start speaking to each other. And she had a terrible feeling she knew what they were going to say. "You're hurt," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. It wasn't a question. The man flinched, his hand instinctively tightening over the wound in his side. He tried to stand straighter, to gather the remnants of his pride. "It's nothing, a disagreement with a thorny branch." It was a pathetic lie, and they both knew it. The dark stain spreading across his shirt wasn't from any branch. It smelled of iron and fear. Evangeline stepped closer, her eyes, those unsettlingly perceptive eyes, assessing the damage. The fabric was torn, and the wound beneath was deep. He was losing a lot of blood. He wouldn't make it to town, even if the livery stable hadn't been a derelict barn full of rats. "That branch must have been holding a pistol," she said, her tone flat. "You need help, now." He stared at her, his storm-gray eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why would she help him? A complete stranger, a dangerous stranger. In his world, kindness was a currency used to buy betrayal. "I don't need anything from you, miss." "You'll be dead by morning if you don't get that wound cleaned and stitched," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "My father taught me a few things. My mother taught me more. You can bleed out in my creek, or you can let me help you. Your choice." There was a challenge in her voice, a strange authority that seemed out of place in a woman so young and isolated. He was wavering, his strength failing. The world was starting to swim at the edges. He looked from her determined face to the dark, unwelcoming path toward town. He was trapped. "There's a barn behind the cabin," she said, seeing his resolve crumble. "Get your horse out of sight. I'll get what I need." She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked back to the cabin with a purpose that belied the frantic beating of her heart. What was she doing? She was breaking every rule she had ever lived by. She was inviting the wolf across her threshold. He watched her go, a strange mix of disbelief and grudging respect on his face. He managed to haul himself back to his feet, grabbing the reins of his stallion. The horse, a magnificent animal named Thunder, nuzzled him with concern. "Easy, boy," he rasped. With the last of his strength, he led the horse toward the small, dark barn. Inside her cabin, Evangeline moved with frantic efficiency. She pulled out a hidden wooden box from beneath a loose floorboard. This wasn't the simple sewing kit she used for dresses. This was her mother's legacy. Inside were bundles of dried herbs, strange-smelling tinctures, and finely crafted surgical tools that would have made Doc Henderson's eyes widen. Yarrow to stop the bleeding, willow bark for the pain, old man's pepper to fight infection, things the good people of Millfield would call witchcraft. She heard the barn door creak shut. He'd made it. The choice was made. There was no turning back now. She took a deep breath, grabbing clean cloths and a bottle of whiskey. This was going to hurt him. A lot. And it was going to bind her to him in ways she couldn't yet imagine. When she entered the barn, the smell of hay and horseflesh mingled with the metallic tang of his blood. He was slumped against a support beam, his face pale and slick with sweat in the dim light. His eyes followed her every move, wary as a cornered animal. "My name is Evangeline Rose," she said, setting her supplies down on a clean patch of straw. He hesitated for a long moment, then grunted. Matthias Thornton." "Well, Mr. Thornton," she said, kneeling beside him, "let's see what kind of trouble you've ridden into." She took a knife and began to carefully cut away the bloody fabric of his shirt. He sucked in a sharp breath as the cloth pulled away, revealing the ragged, ugly wound. It was a bullet hole, clean through his side, but dangerously close to vital organs. She was right. He would have been dead by sunrise. "This is going to be unpleasant," she warned, uncorking the whiskey. "I've had worse," he muttered, though his jaw was clenched tight. She didn't doubt it. As she cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle but firm, she felt the hard ridges of old scars on his back and ribs. This was not the first time Matthias Thornton had been shot. This was not his first dance with death. Who was this man? A gunslinger? An outlaw? She poured the whiskey into the wound, and he let out a strangled cry, his body arching in agony, but he didn't try to stop her. He just grit his teeth, sweat pouring down his temples. Then she began to stitch. Her needle, the same kind she used for fine silk, moved with a speed and precision that was almost hypnotic. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. He watched her, his pain-filled eyes studying her face in the gloom. He saw the fierce concentration, the strange, calm competence. This was no simple seamstress. As she tied off the final stitch, a new sound cut through the night, the baying of hounds, distant, but getting closer. Matthias's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid with tension. The mask of pain was replaced by a look of pure, primal fear. His hand shot to the empty holster at his hip. "They found me," he whispered, his voice a raw, desperate thing. Evangeline froze, the bloody needle still in her hand. The hounds were baying from the direction of town. They weren't just hunting dogs. They were a posse, and they were coming for the man she had just saved. The baying grew louder, a chorus of doom echoing across the desert. Matthias struggled to his feet, his hand gripping the fresh stitches at his side, his eyes wild. "My gun! In my saddlebag!" "Stay down," Evangeline commanded, her voice a sharp hiss. "You can't run, you can barely stand." "They can't find me here," he rasped, ignoring her. "They'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." The fear in his voice was for her, and that small, selfless detail struck her like a physical blow. He didn't know her, yet he was worried about her safety. She pushed him back down, her small frame surprisingly strong. "I said stay down. They won't find you." "How?" he demanded, his breath coming in ragged pants. "How can you possibly stop them?" She didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the barn door, peering through a crack. She could see the flicker of torches now, weaving through the darkness, coming straight for her cabin. At the head of the group was a man she knew all too well, Sheriff Brody, a man with a cheap badge and an expensive loyalty to whoever paid him the most. And behind him were a half-dozen deputized townsmen, their faces grim and excited by the thrill of the hunt. "Sheriff's leading them," she whispered back to Matthias. "Looking for a man who rode through town near dusk, said he was a horse thief." "I didn't steal this horse," Matthias growled, stroking Thunder's neck. "He's all I have left." "Doesn't matter what the truth is," Evangeline said, her mind racing. "It only matters what they believe." She looked around the barn, her eyes darting from the hayloft to the dark corners. There was nowhere to hide that they wouldn't look. The dogs would sniff him out in minutes. Panic began to rise in her throat, cold and sharp. She had invited this danger in. She had stitched herself to this man's fate. If they found him, they would hang him. And they would brand her as an outlaw's accomplice. Her solitary, protected life would be over. Then her eyes landed on the hidden wooden box, the one with her mother's secrets. Her mother hadn't just taught her about herbs to heal. She had taught her about herbs to confuse, to mislead, powders that could dull a dog's sense of smell, oils that could mimic the scent of death and decay, things her mother had called tools of misdirection, things the Reverend would call the devil's work. She had never used them before. She had been too afraid. But now, with the torchlight glinting off the sheriff's badge just 100 yards away, she had no other choice. "Don't make a sound," she ordered Matthias. She grabbed a handful of a pungent gray powder from one of the pouches in her box. It smelled of earth and rot and something else, something sharp and confusing. She moved quickly, sprinkling a thick line of it across the barn's threshold. Then she grabbed a small vial of thick, dark oil and smeared it on the outside of the barn door. "What is that?" Matthias whispered, watching her with a mixture of awe and terror. "A prayer," she said. "Now get in the hayloft. Cover yourself completely, and pray it works." He didn't hesitate. He pulled himself up the ladder, pain lancing through his side with every movement, and burrowed deep into the loose hay. Below, Evangeline took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and walked out of the barn to face the posse. She stood there, a lone, slender figure in the torchlight, her face a calm, unreadable mask. She looked like the innocent recluse they all thought she was. The dogs were going frantic, barking and snarling, pulling at their leashes. They surged toward the barn, then stopped dead at the threshold. They whined, tucking their tails between their legs, refusing to cross the line of gray powder she had laid down. They smelled the oil on the door and recoiled, sniffing at the air with confusion. Sheriff Brody pushed his way to the front, his face flushed with authority. "Evangeline, what's going on? We tracked a horse thief to your property." "A horse thief, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice sweet as honey. "I haven't seen anyone. It's just been me all evening." "The dogs tracked him here," one of the men insisted, pointing at the cowering hounds. "Your dogs seem to be more interested in that dead coyote I dragged away from my chicken coop this afternoon," she said, gesturing vaguely into the darkness. "Poor thing must have taken poison. The smell is awful." The lie was as smooth and practiced as her stitching. She was pointing to the spot where she'd smeared the pungent oil. The men sniffed the air and grimaced. The scent of decay, artificially strong, hung heavy around the barn. It was plausible. Brody looked from her innocent face to his confused dogs, then back again. He was suspicious. He knew there was something not quite right about Evangeline Rose, about her family. He'd heard the whispers. "I'm going to have to search your barn," he said, his eyes hard. Evangeline's heart stopped. The powder might stop the dogs, but it wouldn't stop a suspicious man. "Of course, Sheriff," she said, her voice never wavering. She stepped aside, a perfect picture of compliance. "But I have to warn you. I had a smallpox scare in my flock last month. Had to put down a few birds. Doc Henderson said the barn should be considered contaminated for a while yet." Another lie. Another perfectly crafted piece of misdirection. Smallpox. The word was like a curse on the frontier. The men behind Brody took an involuntary step back. No one wanted to be the one to carry that plague back to their families. Brody hesitated. He looked at the barn, then at her calm, unnerving green eyes. He was a bully, not a brave man. The thought of disease, combined with the bizarre behavior of his dogs and the stench of death, was enough to make him reconsider. "Fine," he grumbled, spitting on the ground. "But if I find out you're lying to me, Evangeline, it'll go badly for you." "I have no reason to lie, Sheriff," she said, her voice soft as a prayer. He stared at her for a long moment more, then turned to his men. "He must have cut through the creek. Let's go. Spread out." The posse moved on, their torches disappearing into the night, their shouts fading into the distance. Evangeline stood perfectly still until the last flicker of light was gone. Then, and only then, did she allow her body to tremble. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against the barn door for support, her knuckles white. She had done it. She had turned them away. A soft rustle came from the hayloft above. Matthias peered down, his face a pale oval in the darkness. He was looking at her not as a seamstress, not as a woman, but as something else entirely, something powerful and dangerous and utterly baffling. "Who are you?" he whispered, and the question hung in the air, more dangerous than any posse. She looked up at him, the secrets of her mother, the legacy of her fear, swirling in her emerald eyes. "I'm the woman who just saved your life," she said. "Now you owe me the truth. All of it." The truth. It was a dangerous commodity, and they were both holding a stockpile. The barn felt less like a shelter and more like a powder keg. The posse was gone, for now, but the real threat was just beginning. Matthias climbed down from the hayloft, his movements stiff with pain and caution. He looked at the line of gray powder, at the vials of strange oils she was now carefully putting back into her hidden box. This was more than just folk remedy. This was a science, a form of defense he'd never seen before. "They'll be back," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Brody isn't a man who likes being made a fool of." "Then you'd better start talking," Evangeline said, snapping the lid of the box shut and sliding it back under the loose floorboard. She turned to face him, her arms crossed. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a hard, demanding resolve. "Who are you, Matthias? And who is it that wants you dead so badly that they'd pay a town sheriff to hunt you down?" He winced, not just from the wound in his side, but from the weight of the question. He owed her. He knew that. He sank onto a low stool, his face haggard in the lantern light. "My name is Matthias Thornton, and I used to be a lawman, a U.S. Marshal." Evangeline's eyes widened slightly. A lawman, not an outlaw? This was not the story she had expected. "Used to be?" "I was investigating a man named Elias Thorne," Matthias said, his voice laced with venom. "A cattle baron back in Texas. He runs his territory like a king, buying up land, buying up lawmen, and killing anyone who gets in his way. He built an empire on blood and fear." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in a painful memory. "I was getting close, too close. I had a witness, a ledger, proof of everything. Thorne found out. He couldn't just kill a marshal. That would bring too much heat. So he did something smarter. He framed me." "Framed you for what?" "Murder," Matthias said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "My partner, my best friend. Thorne's men ambushed us. They killed him with my gun, then shot me and left me for dead. They took the ledger. By the time I came to, there was a warrant out for my arrest, signed by a judge on Thorne's payroll. They called me a disgraced marshal turned killer." The story poured out of him, a torrent of grief and rage. "My wife, Catherine, and my daughter Emma. They weren't killed by cholera like I told you." He couldn't look at her now. The shame was too great. "Thorne's men. After they framed me, they went to my home. to silence them, to make sure I had nothing left to live for, nothing to fight for. They burned it to the ground. My wife and child were inside. A wave of cold horror washed over Evangeline. The story he had told her by the creek, the story of cholera, had been a lie to protect a truth that was 1,000 times more monstrous. The grief he carried wasn't just for their loss, it was for their murder, and it was his guilt for leading the danger to their door. I've been running ever since, he finished, his voice cracking. Running from Thorne's bounty hunters, running from the law that thinks I'm a monster. Trying to get to California to find a federal judge who isn't in Thorne's pocket. Sheriff Brody. He's not just a town sheriff. He's on Thorne's payroll. That horse thief story was just an excuse to kill me and collect his blood money. Silence descended on the barn, thick and heavy. Evangeline finally understood the depth of the trouble she had invited in. This wasn't a simple outlaw. This was a man caught in the jaws of a powerful, ruthless machine, and by helping him, she had just put herself directly in its path. She walked over to him, her expression unreadable. She looked at the fresh stitches, the lines of exhaustion and pain on his face. She should have been terrified. She should have told him to leave at first light. But instead, she felt a strange kinship. He was a man whose life had been stolen by powerful men who operated in the shadows, and she was beginning to suspect her own life had been shaped by the very same forces. "My parents," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My father died in a mining accident. The main support beam just gave way. That's what they said. My mother, she died of a fever a few months later. A fever no one could explain. Doc Henderson did everything he could, but she just slipped away." Matthias looked up, sensing the shift in the conversation. "You don't believe that's what happened." "My mother was like me," Evangeline said, her hand hovering over the floorboard that hid her box. "She knew things, about the earth, about healing. People in town respected her, but they feared her too. They called her an herb woman. Some called her a witch. My father, he was a geologist. He was mapping this territory for the mining company. He told me he'd found something important. He was excited. The day before he died, he told me our lives were about to change." A cold dread began to creep up Matthias's spine. He was a lawman. He knew how to read the patterns, how to see the connections others missed. And the mining company? They were based out of Texas, Evangeline said, her eyes locking with his. A subsidiary of a larger landholding corporation, owned by a man named Elias Thorne. The name hung in the air between them like a death sentence. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Her father must have found something that threatened Thorne's interests, a vein of gold on land Thorne wanted, proof of illegal claims, and Thorne had silenced him. Her mother, with her strange knowledge and sharp mind, was too much of a risk. So he had silenced her too. Doc Henderson, the kindly town doctor who had been her mother's friend, who had tried to save her. He had been the one to sign off on the cause of death. He was the one who always seemed to be watching her, his concern just a little too suffocating. "It wasn't a fever," Evangeline whispered, the horrifying realization dawning on her. "It was poison. Something slow, something undetectable, something a knowledgeable man, a doctor, would know how to administer." They weren't two strangers who had randomly crossed paths. They were two victims of the same man, the same shadow that stretched all the way from Texas to this forgotten corner of Arizona. Her solitude wasn't an accident. It was an assassination. Her parents had been murdered, and the entire town had either been complicit or blind. Matthias stood up, the pain in his side forgotten. He looked at this young woman, this girl who had been systematically isolated and left alone, her entire life a lie constructed by her parents' killer. He had come here seeking refuge, but he had found an ally. He had found the missing piece of his own puzzle. "He's been watching you for 7 years. Matthias said, his voice grim. Doc Henderson. He's not your protector, he's your jailer. He's been making sure you never got strong enough or curious enough to uncover the truth. A knock on the cabin door made them both jump. It wasn't the loud, demanding bang of the sheriff. It was a soft, polite tapping. "Evangeline, my dear," a familiar voice called out. "It's Doc Henderson. I saw the lights from the posse earlier. I just came to make sure you were all right." Evangeline and Matthias exchanged a look of pure terror. The wolf wasn't at the door. He had been inside the house all along. Doc Henderson's voice was a slick balm of false concern, but to Evangeline, it now sounded like a death rattle. The kindly old doctor who had looked after her, who had felt like the last link to her parents, was a monster wearing a familiar face. "Don't answer," Matthias mouthed, his hand instinctively going for a weapon he didn't have. He grabbed a heavy-looking wood axe from the corner of the barn. It wasn't a gun, but it would have to do. "He'll know something's wrong if I don't," she whispered back, her mind racing. "He always checks on me after a storm or any kind of disturbance. It's his routine." A routine, she now realized, that was designed to monitor her, to keep her on a leash. "Evangeline?" Doc Henderson called again, a slight edge to his voice now. "Are you there? I brought you a tonic, to help you sleep." A tonic. The word sent a shard of ice through Evangeline's veins. How many tonics had he given her mother? How many times had he come to the cabin, his little black bag full of poison and lies? "I have to face him," she said, her voice low and determined. "If I hide, he'll get suspicious and come back with the sheriff. We need to control this." She looked at Matthias. "Stay here. Be ready. No matter what you hear, don't come out unless I scream a word. The word is yarrow." It was the herb used to stop bleeding. A code. A signal. Matthias nodded, his knuckles white around the handle of the axe. He hated this. He was a man of action. A marshal. Hiding in a barn while a woman faced down a killer went against every fiber of his being. But he trusted her instincts. She had outsmarted the posse. Maybe she could outsmart the doctor. Evangeline took a steadying breath, smoothed her hair, and composed her face into a mask of sleepy innocence. She walked out of the barn, closing the door softly behind her, and crossed the small yard to her cabin. She unlatched the door and opened it just a crack. "Doc Henderson," she said, feigning a yawn. "You startled me. I was already in bed." The doctor stood on her porch, a small, portly man with silver hair and spectacles that glinted in the moonlight. He held a small bottle in his hand. His smile was warm, fatherly. It made her stomach turn. "My apologies, my dear," he said, his eyes crinkling. "I just worry about you, all alone out here. I saw Brody and his boys heading this way, and I feared the worst." His eyes scanned the inside of her cabin, searching for anything out of place. "It was nothing," Evangeline said, blocking his view. "They thought a thief had come through, but they were mistaken." "Good, good," he said, holding up the bottle. "Still, it's enough to rattle the nerves. I brought you some of my special calming draft, to ensure you have a peaceful night's rest." She looked at the bottle of dark liquid. It was probably harmless this time. A simple sedative. But it was the principle. It was the control. It was the weapon he had used to murder her mother, now offered to her with a smile. She had to take it. Refusing would be an admission of suspicion. "That's very thoughtful of you, Doctor," she said, taking the bottle from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, and she had to fight the urge to recoil. His skin felt cold, reptilian. "Just look after yourself, child," he said, patting her arm. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long. "You look pale. Are you sure you're feeling well? You know you can tell me anything. I'm always here for you." The threat was veiled in kindness. "I'm watching you. I know everything." "I'm fine, Doctor. Just tired," she said, forcing a small smile. "Thank you for checking on me." She closed the door in his face, her heart hammering. She leaned against it, listening as his footsteps receded, the crunch of his boots on the gravel fading into the night. She stood there for a full minute, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. She went to the window and watched until he was completely gone. Then she walked to the fireplace and poured the contents of the bottle onto the dying embers. They hissed and steamed, releasing a faint, sweet smell that made her feel sick. She ran back to the barn, her breath coming in sobs. Matthias was waiting, the axe held at the ready. He saw her face and knew immediately that her suspicions were confirmed. "It's him," she choked out, sliding to the floor. "It was all a lie, my whole life." He knelt beside her, putting a hand on her shoulder. The contact was hesitant, but solid. It was the first time anyone had touched her with simple human comfort in 7 years. The gesture broke through her shock, and a wave of grief and fury washed over her. "He killed them," she whispered, "and he's been pretending to care for me ever since. Why? Why keep me alive?" "Because of what your mother taught you," Matthias said, his voice grim. "Her knowledge. He doesn't know how much you know. He's been keeping you isolated, docile, afraid, so you'd never question him, so you'd never realize your own power." He looked at her hidden box of herbs. "He's afraid of that. He's afraid you're a better healer than he is, just like your mother was." The truth of it settled over her. Her fear, her isolation, it hadn't just been a consequence of her grief. It had been a prison, carefully constructed by Doc Henderson. "We need to leave," Matthias said. "Now. Before he realizes something is wrong. Before the sheriff comes back." "Leave?" Evangeline looked around at the barn, the cabin, the only home she had ever known. "Leave and go where? You're a wanted man, and now, so am I." "We go to California," he said, his voice urgent. "Together. We find that federal judge. We expose Thorne, and in doing so, we expose Henderson. It's the only way." But Evangeline was shaking her head. A new, hard light was dawning in her eyes. The fear was burning away, leaving something cold and sharp in its place. "No," she said. "We don't run." Matthias stared at her. "Evangeline, you don't understand. These are not men you can fight. Thorne has an army." "My father had a journal," she said, her mind suddenly clear. "He kept detailed notes of everything. His geological surveys, his thoughts, everything. He wrote in a code he taught me when I was a girl. If he found something that threatened Thorne, the proof will be in that journal." "Where is it?" Matthias asked, his hope surging. "It's in the cabin. Hidden," she said. She stood up, her small frame radiating a newfound strength. "We're not running, Matthias. I've been running my whole life, hiding in this shell. Not anymore. This is my home. They took my parents from me on this land. I'm not giving them another inch." Her eyes, blazing with green fire, met his. "We're not running," she repeated. "We're going to find that journal, and then we're going to make them pay." The decision hung in the air, audacious and terrifying. To stay and fight was suicide, but to run felt like a betrayal of everything her parents had died for. For Matthias, the choice was agonizing. His every instinct screamed for flight, for the relative safety of the open road. But looking at the fierce determination on Evangeline's face, he saw the same fire that had once burned in him before grief had nearly extinguished it. She was reigniting his will to fight. "All right," he said, his voice low. "We stay. We find the journal. But we do it my way. Fast and quiet. We get the book, and we're gone before sunrise." "No," she said, her resolve hardening into steel. "Finding the journal isn't enough. It's my word against a respected doctor and a powerful baron. We need more. We need Henderson to expose himself." "And how do you plan to do that?" Matthias demanded. "Ask him politely to confess to a double murder?" "We set a trap," she said, her mind already working, piecing together a plan from the fragments of fear and knowledge she possessed. "We use the one thing he's afraid of, my mother's legacy. The plan was simple, and that's what made it so dangerous. Evangeline would pretend to be sick, not just a simple cold, but with strange, frightening symptoms. Symptoms that mimicked the rare poison she suspected Henderson had used on her mother. She would send a message to town with young Timothy Fletcher, the boy who tipped his hat, begging for Doc Henderson's help. "You want to invite him back here?" Matthias asked, incredulous. "After we know what he is?" "He won't be able to resist," Evangeline explained, her eyes alight with a feverish intensity. "He'll have to come, to see if I've somehow discovered the truth, to control the situation, to make sure his secret stays buried. He'll come to treat me. And to poison you for real this time," Matthias finished grimly. "Exactly," she said, "and you will be waiting. You will be my witness. We'll get a confession. We'll have him trapped." It was a wild gamble, a poker game with their lives as the stakes. Everything depended on her ability to act, on Henderson's arrogance, and on Matthias's ability to intervene at the exact right moment. One wrong move, and they would both be dead before morning. As dawn threatened to break, they put the plan into motion. Evangeline used her own tinctures to induce the symptoms, a pale, clammy sweat, a slight tremor in her hands. She looked convincingly ill. Matthias, his face a mask of grim concern, intercepted Timothy Fletcher on his morning ride into town. He spun a tale of Evangeline being struck down by a sudden violent sickness, begging the boy to fetch the doctor immediately. They had only a short time to prepare. Matthias hid himself in the cramped space of Evangeline's bedroom closet, the wood axe clutched in his hands. He had a narrow view of the bed through the slats in the door. It was a terrible vantage point, but it was the only option. Evangeline lay in the bed, the sheets pulled up to her chin, her raven hair fanned out on the pillow. She looked small and fragile, the perfect victim. But beneath the blankets, her hand was gripping a small, heavy pestle from her mother's mortar, a last resort. They waited. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like footsteps on the porch. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Then they heard it. The sound of a horse and buggy approaching at a brisk pace. Doc Henderson had taken the bait. Matthias tensed in the closet, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He watched through the slats as the cabin door opened and Doc Henderson bustled in, his black bag in hand. "Evangeline, my child," he exclaimed, his voice thick with practiced worry. "Timothy told me you were gravely ill." He hurried to her bedside, his eyes scanning her face, his professional mask firmly in place. But Matthias could see something else in his eyes, a flicker of something sharp and calculating. He was assessing her, not as a patient, but as a threat. "I don't know what it is, doctor," Evangeline whispered, her voice weak and trembling. "I woke up shaking. My heart feels strange." There, he cooed, setting his bag down. "We'll have you right as rain in no time." He began his examination, checking her pulse, looking at her eyes. As he worked, he spoke in a low, soothing tone. "You know, my dear, you've been under a great deal of stress. That business with the posse last night. And you've always been so delicate. Just like your mother." The mention of her mother sent a jolt through Evangeline, but she kept her composure. "My mother," she murmured, as if delirious. "I had a dream about her. She was in the garden. She was warning me." Henderson's hands paused for a fraction of a second. His smile tightened. "Dreams can be powerful things, child. Fevers can bring all sorts of strange visions. She said to beware of the calming draft," Evangeline whispered, letting her eyes flutter shut. The air in the room went cold. In the closet, Matthias held his breath. This was it, the moment of truth. Doc Henderson slowly straightened up. The kindly mask dropped from his face, replaced by an expression of cold reptilian fury. He had been so careful for 7 years, so patient. And now this girl, this echo of the woman he had hated and feared, was threatening to unravel everything. "So," he said, his voice no longer soothing, but a low, dangerous hiss, "you finally figured it out. Did that outlaw tell you? The one you're hiding?" Evangeline's eyes snapped open. "He told me nothing. My mother did, in her journal." It was a bluff, a wild card thrown onto the table. They hadn't found the journal yet. But Henderson believed it. His face went white with rage. "That fool! I told him to burn everything." He began to pace the small room like a caged animal. "She was a witch, you know, your mother. She charmed people with her little remedies, made them think she was a saint. But she was stealing my patience, my respect. And your father, with his talk of gold and his secret maps. They were going to ruin everything. They thought they could cut me out." He stopped pacing and turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a terrifying madness. "I gave her a gift, a painless end. I could have made it so much worse. I protected you, Evangeline. I kept you safe, docile. I was going to be your guardian, control the secrets. But you had to be clever." He opened his black bag. His hands rummaged inside, past the bandages and salves. He pulled out a large metal syringe with a long, wicked-looking needle. "It's a shame," he said, filling the syringe from a small, unlabeled vial. "You have her eyes. It's time to put them to sleep. Permanently. This time, there will be no talk of fever, just a tragic, grieving suicide. The girl couldn't live with the shame of harboring a fugitive." He advanced toward the bed, the syringe held like a dagger. Evangeline's hand tightened on the pestle beneath the sheets. She was about to scream the safe word, but it was too late. He was too fast. He lunged. "Yarrow!" she screamed, the word tearing from her throat as she scrambled away from the needle. The closet door exploded outwards. Matthias burst into the room, a whirlwind of righteous fury. He was no longer a weary fugitive. He was a U.S. Marshal, and he was delivering judgment. He swung the heavy wood axe not at Henderson, but at the hand holding the syringe. The sound was a sickening crunch of bone and metal. The syringe flew across the room, shattering against the wall. Henderson shrieked, a high, unholy sound, as he stared at his mangled hand, blood pouring from the wound. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with shock and pain, and tripped over his own medical bag. He fell hard, his head cracking against the stone of the fireplace with a sickening thud. He lay still, a pool of blood spreading out from under his head. Silence descended on the room, broken only by Evangeline's ragged gasps and the sound of blood dripping onto the floorboards. Matthias stood over the doctor's body, the bloody axe in his hand, his chest heaving. It was over. The trap had worked. But the cost was terrifying. Then they heard it, the sound of approaching horses, many of them. And this time it wasn't just the local posse. This was a war party. Through the window they could see a dozen hard-faced men armed to the teeth, riding under a banner they both recognized, the banner of Elias Thorne. Sheriff Brody must have sent a wire after he was made a fool of. He had called in the cavalry. Thorne's private army had arrived, and they had the cabin surrounded. They were trapped. The confession was useless, the battle won, but the war had just arrived at their doorstep. They had traded one monster for a dozen more. The cabin, once a symbol of solitude, was now a fortress under siege. Thorne's men, a pack of ruthless bounty hunters and hired guns, had formed a wide circle around the property, their rifles glinting in the morning sun. There was no escape. "The journal," Matthias said, his voice urgent as he dragged a heavy chest of drawers in front of the door. "It's our only chance. If we can't get out of here, we have to at least make sure the truth does." Evangeline, her shock giving way to adrenaline, nodded. Her mind raced, sifting through years of memories, searching for the hiding place. Her father had loved puzzles, codes, hidden compartments. He wouldn't have kept it anywhere obvious. "The fireplace," she said suddenly. "The stone he was proudest of. The one from the Black Creek quarry." She ran to the hearth, ignoring the still form of Doc Henderson. Her fingers traced the stones until she found it. A single dark gray stone that was just slightly loose. She pressed on it, and a section of the hearth swung inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound journal. Just as her fingers closed around it, the first bullet tore through the window, shattering the glass and burying itself in the opposite wall. The siege had begun. "Get down!" Matthias yelled, pulling her to the floor. They crawled behind the meager cover of an overturned table as a volley of gunfire erupted, ripping through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. Splinters flew through the air like deadly insects. Matthias, armed only with Henderson's dropped pistol and the wood axe, knew they were hopelessly outgunned. He was one man, wounded, against a dozen professionals. But Evangeline was not just a woman. She was a weapon. "My box!" she yelled over the gunfire. "In the barn! I need it!" "You're insane!" he shouted back. "You'll be killed before you take 2 steps!" "They're expecting a gunfight," she countered, her eyes blazing. "They're not expecting a ghost." She pointed to the back of the cabin, where a small root cellar door was hidden under a rug. "It opens up near the creek. They won't be watching it." It was a desperate, suicidal plan, but it was the only one they had. While Matthias laid down covering fire, his shots carefully aimed to make them think he was better armed than he was, Evangeline slipped into the root cellar, the journal clutched to her chest. She emerged in the thick brush by the creek, her heart pounding. She moved like a phantom through the landscape she knew so well, circling around to the back of the barn. She slipped inside, grabbed her mother's box of secrets, and disappeared back into the cellar before anyone knew she was gone. Back in the cabin, she went to work, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. The gunfire provided a deafening cover for her preparations. She mixed powders and oils, creating a series of crude but effective chemical weapons. "The windows!" she yelled to Matthias. He kicked out the remaining shards of glass. Following her instructions, he threw small, tightly wrapped pouches into the yard. They burst on impact, releasing thick clouds of acrid, choking smoke. It wasn't toxic, but it was disorienting, burning the eyes and throat. The gunfire faltered as Thorne's men began to cough and curse. Next came the fire. She had created small packets of a substance that would ignite on contact with the air. Matthias tossed them into the dry brush surrounding the cabin. The brush went up in flames, creating a wall of fire and smoke that further obscured the house and forced the bounty hunters to fall back. They were buying time, but they both knew it wouldn't last. The leader of Thorne's men, a brutal killer named Jasper, was not easily deterred. They could hear him bellowing orders, telling his men to regroup and charge the house. "We have to make a stand," Matthias said, reloading the pistol. "I can hold them off at the door. You take the window." "No," Evangeline said, her face grim. "We bring the fight to them." She had one last trick up her sleeve, the most dangerous one, a fine, glittering powder her mother had called dragon's breath. It was made from ground minerals and dried lichen, and when thrown into a fire, it would explode with the force of gunpowder, sending a shower of burning sparks in every direction. She crept to the front window, peering through the smoke. Jasper and 3 of his men were preparing to storm the porch. It was now or never. "When I give the word," she told Matthias, "shoot the lantern on the porch." She waited until Jasper was just a few feet away. "Now!" she screamed. Matthias's shot was perfect. The lantern exploded, showering the porch in burning oil. At the exact same moment, Evangeline threw the packet of dragon's breath. The resulting explosion was biblical. A massive fireball erupted on the porch, engulfing Jasper and his men. The force of it threw them backwards, their clothes on fire, their screams cutting through the roar of the flames. The remaining bounty hunters, seeing their leader taken down by what looked like black magic, panicked. This wasn't a shootout. This was a slaughter. They were fighting a witch. They broke ranks and fled, disappearing into the desert as fast as their horses could carry them. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning brush and the groans of the wounded men on their lawn. They had done it. They had survived. Breathing heavily, they stood in the ruins of the cabin, the smoking journal held between them. But their victory was short-lived. A new figure was walking through the smoke, slow and deliberate. It was Sheriff Brody, his gun drawn. He had been waiting, letting Thorne's men do the dirty work. "Well, well," Brody said, a smug grin on his face. "Looks like you saved me some trouble." He gestured with his pistol. "Drop the gun, Marshal, and you, witch, give me the book." Matthias and Evangeline exchanged a look. They had survived an army only to be cornered by a rat, but the sound of more horses made Brody's head turn. A large group of riders was approaching, not with the aggression of bounty hunters, but with the grim determination of concerned citizens. It was half the town of Millfield, led by young Timothy Fletcher. They had heard the gunfire, seen the smoke, and had finally found the courage to come and see what was happening to the girl at the creek. They arrived to a scene from a nightmare. The burned porch, the wounded men, the dead doctor in the cabin, and Sheriff Brody holding a gun on Evangeline and the stranger. "Sheriff!" Timothy yelled. "What in God's name is going on?" Brody was trapped. His authority was gone. "Stay back," he snarled, waving his gun. "These two are killers. They murdered Doc Henderson." "He's lying," Evangeline shouted, her voice ringing with a newfound power that made the townsfolk stop and listen. "Doc Henderson murdered my parents, and Sheriff Brody helped him cover it up. He works for the same man who sent these killers here to silence us." She held up the journal. "The proof is right here, my father's words. He documented everything, Henderson's threats, Thorne's illegal land grabs. It's all in here." The townsfolk looked from her fiery, determined face to the sweating, panicked sheriff. They had known Evangeline their whole lives. They had seen her quiet kindness, her strange solitude. They had whispered about her, yes, but they had never known her to be a liar. Brody, on the other hand, was a man they feared, not respected. "Let's see the book, Sheriff," a farmer called out, his hand resting on the stock of his own rifle. Others murmured in agreement. The tide was turning. Brody saw his power crumbling. In a desperate final act of cowardice, he lunged for Evangeline, trying to grab the journal. Matthias moved like a lightning strike. He tackled Brody, sending them both crashing to the ground. The gun went off, the shot going wild. They wrestled in the dirt, a desperate, grunting struggle. But Brody was no match for the marshal's cold fury. Matthias disarmed him and slammed his head into the ground, knocking him unconscious. He stood up, breathing heavily, and looked at the crowd of stunned faces. He was no longer a fugitive. He was the law. The aftermath was a blur. The townsfolk, finally understanding the depth of the betrayal, took Brody and the wounded bounty hunters into custody. The journal, when read aloud, told a sordid tale of greed and murder that shook the town to its core. Elias Thorne, his crimes exposed, would eventually face a justice of his own, hunted by the very federal marshals he had once corrupted. Evangeline and Matthias stood on the porch of their ruined cabin, watching the sun rise on a new day. Her home was destroyed, but for the first time, she felt free. The ghosts that had haunted her were finally at rest. She looked at Matthias, at the man who had crashed into her life and shattered it, only to help her rebuild it into something stronger. The ache of loneliness in her chest was gone, replaced by a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. He looked at her, the strange girl from the creek, the witch, the warrior. She had saved his life, his honor, and his soul. He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time anyone had ever held it. her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. "What now, Marshall?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "Now," he said, his storm-gray eyes softening, "we rebuild." They didn't just rebuild the cabin. They rebuilt a life, together. The woman who had never known an embrace found a home in a lawman's arms. The widower who had run from his grief found a future in a healer's eyes. Their story became a legend in Millfield, a tale of two broken souls who, instead of running from the storm, turned and fought it together, armed with little more than courage and the truth. They found their peace, but some say that on quiet nights you can still hear the whispers of the wind through Willow Creek, not of broken dreams, but of justice delivered. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of the desert, the most powerful magic of all is two people refusing to be afraid. If you believe in the power of fighting back, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because there are 1,000 stories buried in the dust of the Old West, and we're here to dig every single one of them up.